The first notice arrives. It was a Tuesday morning when the letter came. Just a plain white envelope, no different from the coupons or grocery circulars I usually tossed in the bin without a second glance. But this one was stamped in red across the front, vinyl notice. It stopped me cold. I sat on the edge of my recliner, reading the letter 3 times over before it truly sank in. The Homeowners Association, those men and women I used to wave to during community picnics, was threatening to foreclose on my home. Not because I hadn't paid my mortgage. Not because I'd failed to maintain the lawn or violated any noise ordinance. No, they were coming after me over a $200 fee. Specifically, a late fee on a quarterly assessment I had no recollection of missing. They claimed I had ignored multiple notices. They claimed interest had accrued. They claimed the fine was now legally enforceable. And they were moving to collect through foreclosure proceedings. I'm 78 years old, widowed for 12. I've lived in the same little brick house for nearly half a century. Walter and I bought it back when the community was still small, before the lake was dredged and the private golf course went up. We raised our sons here. We celebrated birthdays, mourned losses, and built a life that no one outside these walls could fully understand. I don't have a lawyer. I don't have a pension that stretches far. What I do have is my independence and this home. And now they were threatening to take it away over a sum that, if asked, I would have paid in full without hesitation, if I'd even known about it. I picked up the phone and called the number listed at the bottom of the letter. A young woman with a clipped tone answered. "This is HOA Collections. How can I help you?" I explained my situation, my age, my lack of prior notice, my willingness to settle the amount immediately. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said flatly. "Your account has been forwarded to our legal department. You'll need to contact them directly. The number is on your notice." She hung up before I could respond. I sat there holding the receiver in my lap, the silence in my living room feeling thicker than it ever had. My cat Lily padded softly across the rug and curled herself on the couch. She had no idea what was happening, but I did. Something wasn't right. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking of all the other elderly homeowners in our neighborhood. Were they facing the same thing? Had I missed some meeting where this was announced? Could it really be legal to seize a home over a $200 fee? The next day, I called my son James. He lives 3 states away and teaches math at a community college. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, Mom, everything okay?" I didn't want to worry him, but I also didn't want to lie. "I got a letter," I said softly. "From the HOA. They're saying they'll take the house." I heard the pause on the other end, then the shift in his voice. "What?" "Why, that's insane." I read him the letter. He asked for a photo. I took a picture with my old flip phone and sent it, hoping it went through. He promised to look into it and call me back. An hour later, he had more questions than answers. "It looks legit," he said, "but the amount, it makes no sense. And even if it was unpaid, this isn't normal procedure." I told him I'd never received any other letters. "Mom," he said, "I think you need someone local to help." But I didn't know anyone. Most of my friends had either passed away or moved into assisted living. The few who remained weren't in any condition to get involved. That's when I remembered Lucas. He lived 2 houses down. Young, always tinkering with something in his garage. We'd exchanged pleasantries over the years. He once helped me carry groceries when the handle of my bag snapped. Polite kid. I didn't know much about him, except that he worked with computers. I didn't want to bother him, but desperation nudged me toward his front steps the next morning. I knocked, and he answered wearing grease-stained gloves and a confused expression. "Ms. Eleanor, everything all right?" I held out the letter. I don't know where else to turn. He read it silently, lips tightening as he flipped the pages. "This doesn't smell right," he said finally. "Mind if I take a deeper look?" That was the beginning. Not of a legal battle. Not of some David versus Goliath drama, not yet. It was simply the beginning of someone seeing me. Not as a problem to be solved or a burden to be dismissed, but as a person, a neighbor, a woman who had earned the right to be heard before being cast aside. And as I watched him scan documents with his phone, jotting notes on a legal pad, I felt something shift. Not the fear that still sat heavy in my chest, but a flicker of something I hadn't felt in days. Hope. The paper trail. Lucas returned the next morning, armed with a laptop, a legal pad covered in scribbles, and a look in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. Determination. I stayed up late digging, he said, setting his things down at my kitchen table. And you're not the only one. I sat across from him, hands clasped around a cup of tea. What do you mean? There are at least 4 other homeowners in this neighborhood who've received similar foreclosure threats in the last year, all over small amounts less than $500. Every case followed the same pattern: a missed notice, an inflated penalty, and then the threat of legal action. My stomach churned. That's a pattern. He nodded. It's targeted, Eleanor. I think they're counting on people not fighting back, especially folks who are older, who might not have the time or the means to defend themselves. Lucas opened his laptop and turned the screen toward me. A spreadsheet glowed with names, dates, and numbers. These are the cases I could verify online through public court records. I think there are more, but I'll need to talk to folks. I leaned forward. What can we do? We start by building a case, he said. I can help you file a response to their notice, but we'll need someone with legal experience to take this further. I hesitated. Lawyers are expensive. He smiled gently. Let me make some calls. There's a woman I know, Nina Carter. She's a housing rights attorney who works pro bono on cases like this. By the following week, I was sitting in a modest office across from Nina. She was younger than I expected, with a crisp gray suit and a calm confidence that settled my nerves. I've reviewed the document, she said after offering me water. This is troubling. The HOA's behavior appears not only unethical, but possibly illegal. Nina explained that while HOAs do have the right to collect dues and enforce penalties, foreclosure is considered a last resort. And in most states, she added, the homeowner must be given clear, consistent notice and the opportunity to pay before legal action is taken. I shook my head. They never gave me that. She tapped her pen on the folder. That's the key. We'll start with a demand for documentation, everything they claimed to have sent you. If they can't prove those notices were received, we challenge the foreclosure proceedings. Lucas was there too, leaning in from the corner seat. And if we find out they've done this to others, Nina's eyes sharpened, then we escalate. I left her office feeling more fortified than I had in weeks. It wasn't just about the $200 anymore. It was about principle, about standing my ground. That night, I opened the box of old photographs in my closet. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to remind myself who I was before all this fear took root. There was Walter grinning beside me in the driveway the day we moved in. There were the boys in their Halloween costumes with plastic pumpkins at their feet. There was the photo I took of the backyard when I planted the rose bush that still blooms every spring. This was more than a house. It was a history, and I wasn't going to let them erase it. The next few days passed in a flurry of papers. Nina sent formal requests. Lucas spoke to neighbors. A few of them agreed to come forward cautiously at first, and then with more resolve. We met on my porch one afternoon, folding chairs arranged in a semicircle. A woman named Helen, in her 60s, shared how she had paid her dues in cash at the HOA office, only to be told months later that no record existed. Another man, Frank, received notices despite having sold his home a year before. It was a web, and at the center a board that had grown used to operating unchecked. Lucas printed flyers. Know your rights, they read. We slipped them into mailboxes and pinned them on community bulletin boards. A Facebook group sprang up within days, Clearwater Residents for Fair HOA Practices. Stories poured in. Some were small annoyances. Others were stories like mine, retired people, widows, veterans feeling bullied and betrayed by the very group meant to protect the community. Then something unexpected happened. A journalist reached out. Her name was Clara Evans. She'd seen the Facebook group, read the posts, and wanted to feature the story in a weekend expose. This isn't just about a neighborhood, she told me on the phone. This is a trend I've been tracking across the country. I hesitated. Do you think people will care? Clara's voice was sure. You're fighting for your home. Everyone understands that. We met on a sunny Thursday morning. Clara filmed me walking through my garden framed by the rose bushes and the old oak tree Walter had planted. She asked thoughtful questions. I answered the best I could. When she asked how I felt seeing my name in court documents threatening foreclosure, I said the truth. I felt invisible, but not anymore. The segment aired 2 nights later. Lucas texted me 5 minutes after it ended, "You were amazing." And just like that, everything changed. The next morning, I had 10 voicemails from neighbors. Strangers sent letters of support. A local law firm offered assistance. Even the mayor's office called asking if we needed mediation support. Nina called it a momentum shift, but I still hadn't heard from the HOA. That silence, it felt louder than anything. I knew they were regrouping, maybe consulting their own lawyers, maybe plotting a PR response. But I didn't care, because now we weren't alone. And for the first time since that letter arrived, I believed we might actually win. The retaliation, the calm, didn't last. Just days after the news story aired, a certified letter arrived in my mailbox from the HOA's legal representative. The wording was sharp, sterile, and coded in legalese, but the message was crystal clear: cease all defamatory public communications or face legal consequences. I read it twice, then a third time. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. I had expected this. In fact, I welcomed it. Nina read the letter over speakerphone. "They're bluffing," she said. "They're trying to intimidate you into silence. This is classic slap strategic lawsuit against public participation." "Can they sue me?" I asked calmly. "They can file," she replied. "But they won't win. We're protected by the First Amendment. You're telling the truth and doing so in the public interest." Lucas's voice cut in from the background. "Let them try. It'll backfire." But the HOA didn't stop there. That week, a citation was taped to my door: code violation, unkempt lawn. The grass was less than 3 inches high. 2 days later, another notice: unauthorized modifications. Apparently, the wind chime hanging from my porch, the one Walter gave me on our 25th anniversary, was now considered non-compliant decor. They fined me $75. Neighbors started reporting similar harassment. One man got cited for a paint shade approved years ago. Another received a notice for improper holiday decorations after leaving a wreath on her door past New Year's. It was retribution, petty, obvious, and desperate. We documented everything. Lucas helped me set up a small camera near my front door. We kept records, timestamps, photos, emails. Nina began filing a formal complaint with the state's HOA Regulatory Commission. But the real breakthrough came from Helen. She had saved a copy of her old payment receipt, the one the HOA claimed never existed. On the back, scribbled in fading pen, was a note from the HOA treasurer, initialed and dated. It was proof. Not just that Helen had paid, but that someone inside the HOA was lying. Nina smiled when she saw it. This changes everything. We updated Clara, the reporter, and she published a follow-up. This time it included Helen's story and mine, and quoted Nina directly. The article went viral. Comments flooded in from across the country. People shared their own HOA nightmares, their own battles. It wasn't just Clearwater anymore. It was national. And then finally, the HOA board responded. They called for an emergency meeting. For the first time in recent memory, they invited the community. Not just homeowners, but residents, renters, seniors, everyone. The room was packed. Lucas stood beside me. Nina, cool and poised, took a seat in the second row. Clara brought her camera crew. Even a representative from the mayor's office stood quietly in the back. The board president, a man named Edward Marshall, adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "We understand," he began, "that recent events have caused distress and concern." Murmurs rippled through the room. "We want to assure the community that the HOA has always acted with integrity and in accordance with our charter." That's when I stood up. "Then why," I asked, "did I receive a foreclosure notice for a fee I never owed?" Silence. "And why have 5 other homeowners received similar threats in the last 12 months? I held up the spreadsheet Lucas compiled. "These aren't isolated incidents, they're patterns, and they point to abuse of power." Nina stood next. "We've submitted a formal complaint. We're calling for a third-party audit of all HOA financials. We're demanding transparency." People clapped. Some shouted yes, others simply nodded with tears in their eyes. Edward tried to regain control, but the tide had turned. For the first time in a long while, the board didn't hold the room. The people did. By the end of the night, a vote was proposed: a temporary freeze on all collections and foreclosures pending investigation. It passed overwhelmingly. As we left, someone stopped me in the parking lot. A teenage girl, no more than 16, handed me a folded piece of paper. "My grandma lives on Elm Street," she said softly. "She got a letter too. Thank you for fighting." I unfolded the paper when I got home. It was a hand-drawn sketch of my house, with the wind chime on the porch and flowers blooming in the yard. At the bottom, in careful cursive, she had written, "This is what home looks like. I sat on the couch and cried for the first time since all this began. Not out of fear, but out of hope. We weren't just resisting anymore. We were reclaiming. The audit uncovers the truth. The morning the auditors arrived, the neighborhood felt unusually quiet, like the stillness before a storm. Officially, the audit was scheduled to be cooperative, a term the board used in their last newsletter printed in bold letters, as if goodwill could be manufactured after years of secrecy. But we weren't relying on their cooperation anymore. We had our own momentum now, and the truth had weight on our side. The firm that volunteered to conduct the audit was independent, funded in part by a legal aid initiative for elder rights and housing fairness. Nina had connections there. She made a single call, and they were on board within hours of the board's forced approval. The auditors weren't flashy, just two unassuming professionals with clipboards, laptops, and laser focus. Lucas and I met them at the HOA office that morning. The board president, Edward Marshall, tried to greet them with the stiff professionalism of a man who still thought he had control. But the auditors barely looked up as they set up in the boardroom and asked for full access to all records from the past 7 years. 7, Edward echoed. The community motion requested 5. We allow for buffer years, one of them replied without blinking. I almost smiled. Over the next several days, they combed through the mess. Files were missing. Receipts were inconsistent. Several payments, especially those from elderly residents, had disappeared from the ledger without explanation. A paper trail led to an off-the-books account used for beautification projects, which turned out to be nothing more than a personal slush fund for 3 board members. When Nina got the preliminary findings, she called me immediately. It's worse than we thought, she said, her voice tight. They've been charging duplicate fees to select residents. It wasn't random, it was targeted. I swallowed hard. Targeted how? Mostly seniors, widows, veterans, people less likely to fight back. And guess who authorized every action? Edward Marshall. Bingo. The news traveled fast. The local paper ran another headline, Clearwater HOA under investigation for financial misconduct. The story was picked up by a state news outlet. Clara's third expose aired the next night this time, with interviews from neighbors I hadn't even met before, faces older than mine. All with similar stories, their voices steady but wounded. One woman, Agnes Rivera, explained how she'd been too embarrassed to tell anyone that her fixed income was being drained monthly for weed control she never approved. Another, a retired Marine named Charles Brooks, shared how he was threatened with lien placement just weeks after a hospital stay. I fought in 2 wars, he said, but I never thought I'd have to fight my neighbors. The dam had broken. The final audit report was damning. It listed a total of $172,000 in misappropriated fees over 6 years. It found that board members had manipulated records to create a pattern of silent financial coercion. And perhaps most astonishingly, it revealed that the foreclosure attempt on Helen's home had been initiated based on a completely fabricated notice, backdated and signed electronically without her knowledge. The evidence was overwhelming. Nina didn't wait. She filed a civil suit on behalf of over 20 homeowners. By then, more than 60 residents had signed a petition calling for the immediate removal of the entire board. The board's emergency meeting that month was unlike anything Clearwater had ever seen. The community center was standing room only. Local news cameras were stationed at the back. A police presence stood quietly at the doors, not for drama, but for transparency. Lucas stood beside me, phone in hand, streaming the whole thing live. Edward stepped up to the podium, but before he could speak, Agnes Rivera stood and said, "We motion for vote of no confidence in the board's leadership." It was seconded before she sat down. What followed was 2 hours of public comment. One by one, residents stood and told their stories. Some cried, some seethed, some simply asked, "Why, when it was my turn?" I said only this: I am 78 years old. I've paid every bill, lived with dignity, and contributed to this community for over 3 decades. And yet I was nearly forced out of my home for $200. Didn't even owe. That's not leadership. That's cruelty. When the vote came, it was unanimous. The board was dissolved on the spot. A temporary committee of residents, including Agnes, Charles, and yes, even Lucas, was appointed to oversee transition and initiate democratic elections. Edward tried to walk out unnoticed, but Clara was there with her mic, And when she asked if he had anything to say to the residents he'd targeted, he muttered, "No comment," and disappeared into the night. It wasn't justice yet, but it was the beginning. The next morning, Lucas handed me a mug of coffee and said, "You realize what just happened, right?" I nodded slowly. We got our home back. And we had. But it wasn't just about what we lost. It was about what we could build. The lawsuit that changed everything. The courthouse didn't feel like the place justice lived. It was beige, institutional, too quiet. But that day, as I stepped inside, flanked by Nina on one side and Lucas on the other, something shifted in me. I realized we weren't there to beg. We were there to reclaim. The class action lawsuit, officially titled Clearwater Residents vs. Edward Marshall et al., named 7 former HOA board members as defendants. It cited fraudulent foreclosure practices, unlawful enrichment, elder financial abuse, and breach of fiduciary duty. Nina had compiled a mountain of evidence, audit records, sworn declarations, audio from community meetings, even screen captures of emails where board members mocked old-timers who forget to check their balances. What caught the court's attention wasn't just the paper trail. It was the pattern, the deliberate focus on vulnerable homeowners, the systemic silencing of complaints, and the calculated manipulation of legal threats to seize homes. The trial was scheduled as a civil proceeding, but made headlines like a criminal case. The local paper printed a full timeline of events. A state watchdog group showed up. Clara covered it, live streaming each major development. When I took the stand, the courtroom was packed. Nina gave me a small nod. "Just speak your truth." So I did. I told the judge how I received that foreclosure notice, how I called and received nothing but robotic replies. I spoke about the sleepless nights, the humiliation, the helplessness of seeing a $200 error turn into a $20,000 threat. I mentioned Helen and her seizure. I spoke about Lucas, about how this fight had brought generations together. And when I said this wasn't about money, it was about control. I felt the air shift. The judge listened, scribbling now and then. But when Agnes Rivera took the stand next and opened with, "They used my trust against me," I saw his pen stop moving altogether. Over the next 4 days, the courtroom heard from 15 residents. Some needed help walking to the stand. Others came in full uniform, retired military law enforcement teachers. Each told a variation of the same story: misplaced dues, false notices, silence, fear, and finally the resolve to rise. The defense floundered. Their attorney, a smarmy man in a blue-gray suit named Peterson, tried everything. He blamed administrative errors, claimed software bugs, even accused us of a political smear campaign. But under cross-examination, Nina revealed internal emails discussing pressure points and how to keep certain residents too distracted to fight back. Peterson's face paled. The final blow came from Charles Brooks. He stood tall despite his cane and said, "You think we don't know how to read contracts? We signed up for a community, not a kingdom." On the last day, the judge returned with a 17-page ruling. Verdict in favor of the plaintiffs. The judgment included full reimbursement of all illegitimate charges to all residents over a 10-year span, a permanent injunction preventing the former board members from serving on any homeowners association in the state, civil penalties totaling over $900,000, mandate for Clearwater's HOA to undergo structural reform, including third-party oversight for 5 years. The courtroom erupted not in chaos, but in relief. Some cried, others simply nodded as if reclaiming something quiet but precious. As the press surrounded Nina, she pulled me forward. "This woman is the reason this happened," she told the cameras. She stood up when no one else dared to. "This isn't just a win, it's a roadmap." That night, I sat on my porch with Lucas. The stars were out, the air warm. He handed me a glass of iced tea and asked, "Do you think it's over?" I looked out at the quiet street. "Not over," I said, "but different. Better. Because the truth is, justice doesn't undo harm, but it acknowledges it. And when a community rises together, the healing begins." The next day, a letter came from Helen's daughter. Handwritten, it read, "Thank you for standing in the gap. You gave Mom dignity again. And to people like her and to me, that means everything." I folded it and placed it in the old recipe box where I kept things that mattered. 1 page, but the weight of a world. A town awakened. The days following the court's decision felt like waking up after a long, dreamless sleep. I had lived in Clearwater for over 40 years. Yet I had never seen the community quite like this, alive, alert, and newly aware. For so long we had accepted the HOA's authority as inevitable, unshakable like a stone monument that no one dared to touch. But now, it was cracked wide open and the light was pouring in. Lucas and I weren't the only ones walking the neighborhood those days. People were out on porches again. I saw neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years stopping to chat, waving across yards. The fear was dissipating. And in its place, something better was growing connection. The HOA board had been officially dissolved pending reformation. A state-appointed committee was overseeing its replacement. A temporary hotline was set up for residents to report prior abuses or irregularities. And the house that once bore the intimidating sign HOA Enforcement Office had its lettering removed and its locks changed. But the greatest change came not in buildings or bylaws. It came in people. A week after the ruling, Nina organized a community town hall at the local middle school auditorium. Lucas helped set up folding chairs. I brought a box of cookies mostly out of habit, though I noticed they were gone in 10 minutes. The room was full to bursting: seniors, young families, teens, journalists, even 2 state senators quietly sitting in the back row. Nina took the stage, flanked by Agnes Rivera and Charles Brooks. Her voice rang clear, confident, but never condescending. She spoke of transparency, of rebuilding trust, of not just creating new rules, but creating new values. This isn't just about who signs the checks or collects the dues, she said. It's about what kind of place we want to live in and what kind of neighbors we choose to be. When the microphone was passed around, I expected timid questions. Instead, what followed were stories, personal ones. A young mother recalled how she was fined for her daughter's chalk art. A veteran shared that he had once paid fees twice out of fear of being targeted. Even the high school valedictorian spoke about how they had to do a civics project on community structures and now wanted to include Clearwater as a case study. There was pain in those voices, yes, but there was resolve too. The next morning, the story went national. It started with a write-up in the New York Times foreclosure over $200. Sparks class action victory. That same afternoon, Clara's podcast episode hit over 1 million downloads. Then came a CNN feature. Local leaders across the country began citing Clearwater as an example of grassroots governance change. HOA reform panels were formed in 3 neighboring counties within the month. It was surreal watching something so personal unfold on such a large scale. I didn't feel famous, but I did feel seen. Lucas joked that I needed a manager, but I was more interested in a new project. You see that letter Helen's daughter wrote? It stayed with me. Her words, "You gave mom dignity again," stirred something deep. I began to wonder how many other moms were out there, quiet, overlooked, dismissed by systems built for efficiency, not empathy. So I called Nina. What if we created a program, I said, that trained residents to understand their HOA rights, not just in Clearwater, but everywhere? Within weeks, we had the start of something real. The Porch Light Project, named for the idea that every resident deserves to leave their porch light on without fear. Nina's firm provided legal outlines. Clara offered to help promote. A local nonprofit donated space. And Lucas, he designed the logo, a little house, glowing against a night sky. Our first workshop had 10 attendees. The next had 35. Then came invitations from across the state. Through it all, I remained in my home. The front porch, the lemon tree. The same creek that ran behind the property, babbling as it always had. But inside me, something had changed. The woman who once read notices with dread was now drafting toolkits for courage. People started stopping me at the grocery store, at the post office, once even at the gas station. "You're the one from the story," a man said. "I'm one of many," I replied, because that was the truth. This was never just about me. It was about all of us. About those who stayed quiet because they were scared. About those who didn't know they were allowed to speak up. About those who had lost too much already to risk another fight. Now they had a path, and we had each other. The old woman on Pine Street, her name was Beatrice Lawson, and she lived 3 blocks down from me in a slate blue cottage with white shutters and ivy that curled up around the mailbox like nature's own signature. I'd passed by her house 100 times, maybe more, always meaning to stop and say hello, but never quite doing it. Until one afternoon, about 2 months after the court case had ended, I saw her struggling to carry a bag of mulch across her lawn. I pulled over, got out, and offered a hand. "You're the one from the HOA thing," she said, not as a question, but a statement. I nodded. Beatrice smiled soft and knowing. "I remember when you were just the young woman with a stubborn truck that always backfired on Sundays." We talked for a while that day. I ended up helping her lay the mulch, repair a broken hinge on her gate, and drink 2 glasses of iced tea on her porch. But somewhere between those ordinary tasks, she told me something that stuck. "They tried to take this house from me once," she said, "over a mailbox. Said it was too decorative, against code. I cried for a week before my son came and put up one of those ugly standard ones. I haven't dared change it since." Her voice trembled, not with weakness, but with restraint, like someone who had learned to live small so she wouldn't be noticed and punished. It wasn't just Beatrice. Over the next few weeks, I heard echoes of her story again and again. A widower fined for keeping a memorial bench in his garden. A single mother threatened with lien notices because her children's bikes were visible from the street. A man with Parkinson's penalized for excessive weeds when he couldn't mow on time. And worst of all, a woman in her late 60s who was currently fighting foreclosure over a flower bed. Apparently, her perennials violated spacing regulations. That was it. I knew the porch light project had to grow. I contacted the local library and asked to reserve their meeting room every Saturday. We'd offer help reading letters from HOAs, explaining legal language, drafting responses. We weren't lawyers, but we could be listeners, translators, and defenders. People showed up, not just the elderly or vulnerable, but middle-aged professionals, college students, even teenagers who came to learn how to protect their families. Clara recorded a session for her podcast. Nina offered to bring in pro bono lawyers once a month. Lucas set up a website with downloadable guides. One night, Beatrice attended. She brought homemade muffins, sat in the back, and took notes like a freshman in college. Afterward, she hugged me. "I thought I was too old to start again," she whispered. "But maybe I just needed to see someone else do it first." The stories kept coming, and we kept listening. We didn't call it activism. We called it neighboring. And it spread. An HOA president from 2 towns over resigned after residents confronted him with information from one of our workshops. A community in the next county revised its entire charter using one of our templates. The State Bar Association reached out to Nina, curious about how our work might integrate with mediation outreach. One morning, I woke up to an email that nearly knocked the breath out of me. It was from Beatrice's granddaughter. She wrote, "Thank you for giving my grandma her voice back. She's painting again." She even submitted a landscape to the county fair. She told me, "For the first time in years, I feel like I matter." I printed it and taped it to the wall above my desk. That same afternoon, I got a call from a name I hadn't expected to see again: Edward Marshall, the former HOA board member, the man who once voted to foreclose on a 78-year-old woman over 200. "Can we meet?" he asked. I hesitated, but agreed. We sat across from each other in the corner booth of a quiet diner. Edward looked older, not just in years, but in spirit. His shoulders didn't carry that puffed authority anymore. "I've been volunteering," he said. "Homeless shelter downtown." They asked me why. I told them I had some things to answer for. We talked for an hour. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't offer excuses. Just a simple truth: I was wrong. And I'm sorry. And for some reason, that meant something. Not everything, but something. As I walked home later that evening, I passed Beatrice's house. The mailbox had changed. A new one, hand-painted elegant, with climbing roses in gentle watercolor strokes. No citation appeared the next day. No threat, just silence, sweet unpunishing silence. Sometimes justice looks like a courtroom. Other times it looks like a mailbox covered in flowers. The letter that changed everything. It started with an envelope, plain, unassuming, with no return address. I found it in my mailbox one crisp October morning, nestled between grocery coupons and a flyer for gutter cleaning. The paper was thick, almost old-fashioned, and when I held it up, I noticed the edges were hand-trimmed. Inside was a single-page typewritten, "You don't know me, but I've followed your story. My name is Dorothy Hughes. I'm 82. 2 years ago, my HOA began fining me for not replacing my shingles after a storm. I had no family nearby and couldn't climb a ladder myself. They refused to offer me an extension. I paid until my savings ran dry. Then they filed for foreclosure. I'm writing from the county assisted living facility. I lost my home. I've tried to tell someone what happened, but no one listened. Until I saw you on the news. I don't want anything. I just wanted you to know. You're not alone. And neither am I anymore. I must have read it 10 times standing in my kitchen, with the letter shaking slightly in my hands. I sat down, laid it on the table, and just stared. It was a quiet punch to the chest. I showed the letter to Clara. She didn't say anything at first, just wiped her eyes and asked for a copy. Nina read it twice and then said, "We need to do something bigger." That was the beginning of the Hughes bill. Nina, fueled by every ounce of her pro bono fire, proposed it first. A legislative initiative protecting elderly homeowners from predatory HOA actions. We'd need data testimonies, political backing. It felt like a mountain, but we'd already climbed one. We got to work. Beatrice wrote a personal statement. Lucas compiled statistics. Sophie interviewed residents whose lives had been upended by arbitrary fines. Clara created a podcast miniseries, The Price of the Porch, that racked up over 500,000 downloads in its first month. Nina drafted the first version of the bill herself. She called it the Homeowner Dignity Act, but we all knew what it really was, Dorothy's legacy. We organized a town hall, not just in our county, but streamed statewide. Residents tuned in from across the state. Some shared their own HOA horror stories. Others just listened, finally seeing their pain reflected in public. The press came. Local representatives took notes. A junior senator requested a meeting. I visited Dorothy. The facility was clean, sunlit, modest. She greeted me from a wheelchair, her hands soft but steady. When I told her about the bill, she blinked slowly and said I thought I was a ghost. "You're not," I told her. "You're the reason this is happening." She gave me the faintest smile. Then I'm glad I wrote that letter. It took 4 months. 3 drafts, and an endless train of phone calls and interviews. But eventually, the Hughes bill was introduced to the state legislature. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And on the day it passed, the state senate, I drove to Dorothy's facility with a framed copy of the bill and a bouquet of sunflowers, her favorite. She was too weak to speak, but her eyes said enough. We left the frame beside her bed. She passed away 3 weeks later. At her memorial, only 3 people came from her family. But there were 35 others, residents, volunteers, neighbors, people who had seen her letter, who had benefited from the project she unintentionally began. And me. Just a woman who had once been furious about a $200 fee, standing in quiet awe of a woman who'd written a letter and helped reshape a state's housing law. I carried that grief like a candle, lit, tender and glowing. A few days later, the governor signed the bill into law. We celebrated at the bridge. There was no stage, no cameras. Just Beatrice, Clara, Sophie, Lucas, Sarah, Nina, and me, each holding a sunflower. We placed them one by one on the railings. And for a long moment, no one spoke. Because sometimes silence isn't emptiness, it's reverence. Ripples across the country, news of the bill's passage didn't just stay within our state. The story of a 78-year-old widow nearly losing her home over $200, and the movement that rose in her defense caught fire. National outlets picked it up. The Washington Post, NPR, even a late-night talk show host made a joke about HOA thugs getting schooled by a grandma and her neighbors. But it wasn't funny to us. It was vindication. I remember the moment. It truly hit me. I got a letter this time from Oregon. Inside was a photo of a man in his 60s standing on the porch of a modest cabin, holding a printed sign that read, "Because of you, I still have my home." Beneath the photo was a single sentence. They tried the same thing. I fought back, and I won. Hundreds of similar messages followed. Retirees, veterans, single mothers, even renters stuck in HOA-managed townhomes, they all wrote, messaged, or called. Some had success stories, others were just beginning to fight. But the energy had shifted. The fear was still there, but it had been joined by something more powerful, courage. Clara started hosting weekly forums on housing rights. Nina was asked to help draft similar bills in 3 other states. Beatrice, at 68 years old, was interviewed on a morning news show where she famously said, "If you can't respect the people who built this townhome, you shouldn't be allowed to run it." I couldn't walk into the post office without someone shaking my hand. People drop by the bridge daily now, not just to cross it, but to reflect. There were hand-painted signs along the path, "Justice crossed here." Elder rights are human rights. And my favorite, drawn in chalk by a child, "This bridge is strong because we are." Still, not everything was easy. The former HOA board members had quietly moved away, leaving behind legal messes, unpaid debts, and broken community trust. The new board, elected by a public, transparent vote, was working hard to rebuild. They asked for my help more than once, but I always declined politely. I had no interest in power. I'd had enough of that for one lifetime life. Instead, I spent my time mentoring others. I began working with an organization that provided legal advocacy for elderly homeowners. We visited small towns, suburbs, even trailer parks anywhere HOA abuse had taken root. I shared my story, answered questions, and most importantly, listened. Because every community has its bridge. Sometimes it's literal, sometimes it's emotional. In one town, it was a park bench where a group of retired teachers had been fined kalimat kledi for holding book clubs without proper authorization. In another, it was a community garden bulldozed because it didn't match approved landscaping pallets. But everywhere there were people ready to take it back. One afternoon, I sat with Sophie by the creek. She was older now in high school and already talking about college and social justice internships. She kicked her feet in the water and said, "Do you ever think about how it would have gone if you hadn't fought?" "All the time," I said. "I wouldn't have lost my house, but we would have lost something bigger." She nodded. "I think about that too. I think you built more than a bridge." I smiled. "Maybe. But the truth is I didn't build it alone." She skipped a stone across the water. "Yeah. But someone had to go first." We sat there, the sun dipping behind the hills, the water moving slowly beneath us like time itself. And for it, the moment felt exactly as it should be. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Her porch light stays on. Her name was Beatrice Hayes, and she lived in my home. My home. She was 84. Every night, her porch light glowed softly from the house that once stood on the edge of being taken away. That warm beacon was more than just a light. It was a declaration. A quiet reminder that some things are worth fighting for. After the trial, after the legislation, after the headlines faded and faded, life didn't become a fairy tale. There were still disputes, still complaints about lawn lengths and mailbox colors. But now those conversations were tempered with a memory of what happens when people forget their neighbors are human beings, not obstacles to control. She began walking again, further and further each week. She made it part of her morning ritual to stroll across the bridge, my bridge, now officially named the Beatrice Hayes Crossing, thanks to a community petition. There, she'd sit on the bench Sophie had painted herself, surrounded by flowers and hummingbirds, sipping tea from a thermos and waving to kids on their way to school. Every once in a while, someone would join her. A newcomer asking about the story behind the plaque. A teenager curious about why there were cameras mounted by the creek. A couple thinking about joining the neighborhood and wondering quietly if the HOA still had that kind of power. She'd smile and tell them power only matters if you don't know your worth. For me, life slowed to a steady rhythm. I planted tomatoes. I helped a neighbor build a ramp for their mother's wheelchair. I declined interviews, book deals, even a documentary crew. This story belonged to our town, not to headlines or streaming platforms. But I did accept one invitation. Sophie, now in college, had been invited to speak at a national student forum on civic justice and reform. She asked me to come with her. The stage was large, the room packed with young faces brimming with purpose. When she introduced me, she didn't list my title or tell the story word for word. She said, "This is the woman who taught me the difference between being angry and being brave." When it was my turn to speak, I looked out and saw so many versions of myself, quiet, unsure, desperate for permission to push back. I said, "Don't wait for someone else to stand up first. Don't wait until the line's been crossed. The moment you feel something's wrong, that's your moment. That's your line. Don't let them redraw it while you're looking away." The room was silent. Then came the applause. Afterwards, a student came up and asked the same question I'd been asked 100 times before. What would have happened if you hadn't fought back? I took a long breath. I would have lost my home, I said. And we would have lost a bridge. But worse than that, we would have lost the belief that we had a right to fight at all. That's the legacy, I think. Not just the bridge, not just the law, but the spark. Back home, Bridge Day became an annual tradition. Food trucks, music, hand-painted rocks, lining the walkway, just like that first year. And every time the kids would run to Beatrice asking her to tell the story again. She always did with a smile and a soft voice that made even the rowdiest of them sit still. She died peacefully 5 years later. In her sleep, in her home. At the funeral, people came from out of state. Letters arrived from places we'd never heard of. One bouquet came with a note from a woman in Utah. Because of Beatrice, my father didn't die alone in a trailer park. He died at home with dignity. The bridge was covered in flowers for weeks. At the next bridge day, they added something new, a lantern walk at dusk. Quiet, gentle, with candles floating down the creek. A moment of stillness to remember her and all the people who stood when they could have sat down. As I watched the lanterns drift, a young boy stood beside me, eyes wide. "Did you build the bridge?" he asked. I smiled. "No, we all did." He nodded solemnly, as if he understood more than most adults ever would. He ran ahead, joining the others, the light of the lanterns catching in his hair. And I stood there on the bridge they tried to destroy. On the bridge we took back, and I knew beyond any doubt, her porch light was still on, in all of us.